No puede haber poetas profesionales.
Somos nuestros campesinos, ¿qué pasa en el país y qué necesitamos?
A mí me gusta más la ficción porque me interesa contar historias.
So, first of all, thank you for coming to Bogotá. Thank you for coming to the Universidad de los Andes. It's a pleasure for us to have you here. It's a delight for our students at the economics department and many other departments that we saw in the audience. And thank you to Bavaria and Sam Miller for inviting you also and bringing you here. Of course, the main topic is your new book with Elda Shafir on scarcity. It motivated me and many other people on different issues. And I want to dig a little bit on some of these things. So bandwidth seems to be apparently a good measure of how people have this capacity to engage into their daily lives or be limited by that. And the first question that I wanted to ask you about bandwidth is, if we were able to design a good thermometer, a good device to measure bandwidth, so we could have better information, how would that look like, that thermometer of bandwidth?
Yeah, so before we even talk about what the thermometer is, I think it's a good question because it's worth remembering that until the 1940s, 30s, we didn't even measure GDP.
Yeah.
We didn't. So as we're now expanding what we measure, now people are trying to measure happiness. But why not also measure that feeling we've all had? You've had a day where you just felt really low cognitive capacity, self-control was low, your ability to think clearly was low. That sort of fluctuations in bandwidth. One reason measuring it could be helpful was it's entirely plausible that in 2008, the US just got dumber. People had a lot on their mind, they were worried about it, they just got dumber. Wouldn't that be useful to know that we just got dumber, or that we had an explosion, just like we wanted to know income went up and down? The good thing about bandwidth is that I think it's relatively easy to measure because for about 50 years, psychologists have been coming up with measures of cognitive capacity. Very simple exercises you can give people that have them undertake trivial tasks. Quickly measure it. Ironically, there are bandwidth measures that already exist without us realizing it. For example, we're doing some work now in the amount of typos you put in when you go in Google search. Probably a pretty good measure of bandwidth. Yeah. And so you can kind of get these other measures that are already implicitly there. But it'd be pretty easy to construct a 5-minute pen and pencil survey, even easier to have a cell phone-like app that you play with. One of the things that I sometimes play is these little games on my iPhone. And some of these games are perfect measures of bandwidth. And you'll notice it yourself when you play these games. Some days you're really on, some days you're not. So it'd even be easy to come up with measures of bandwidth that are even fun to do, because they're just measures of cognitive capacity.
So in that sense, would you use these measures of bandwidth to, for example, focalize social programs, thinking of people who are in more desperate situations than others, and therefore focalize these resources according to that, as opposed to other measures like income?
So I might think of it as, to think of resources, I might also use it to say, if I'm going to have a program that comes and tells you about this is what high school will be like for your child. Yeah. Right now we go and do these programs, or HIV education. We just do them at an arbitrary time. Isn't it better to come at a time when you're high on bandwidth, because that's when you're actually able to absorb it? Like there may be programs we have right now whose primary benefit is to increase bandwidth, but we'd never know because we're not even measuring it. Yeah. And if you didn't measure it, it'd be a weird thing to say, my program increased IQ. It sounds odd, but it seems like some programs might be, which would be a pretty amazing finding.
Yeah. And definitely the connection between IQ and bandwidth is so clear now that by helping bandwidth, then you increase the capacity to solve problems. Let me move from that into conditional transfers. You are interested in this. It's a policy that is being used worldwide and it's growing and growing. And how do you see the relationship between conditional transfers and bandwidth? And in particular, is there evidence that conditional transfers are capable of increasing bandwidth? in a causal way.
Yeah. So there's evidence that unconditional transfers can increase bandwidth, a little bit of evidence. I don't know yet evidence whether conditional transfers could, and I think one of the reasons is conditional transfers as they're constructed, by giving cash, they get rid of the cognitive burden of poverty. So that's good. That's the transfer part. But the conditionalities often have their own bandwidth tax. It's like someone says, now you've got to do this, this, and this. So one thing that I think people don't do well enough is being very parsimonious in thinking about how they want to put conditions on. Some programs are good, they have a few. Some programs are bad, they put 40 conditions on. It's kind of overwhelming. Also, I think programs aren't very smart about how they put the conditions on. If you ever play video games on an iPhone, they do this very smart thing where when the level 1, the game will be very simple. And at level 8, they'll add one more wrinkle. And at level 24, one more wrinkle. So, but by the end, when you've been playing a lot, it's a very complex game. But each step of the way, it's one new level is added. And I think conditional cash transfers could be dramatically improved. I mean, they already work, and that's great, but they could be dramatically improved even in their impact, but also in their bandwidth impact, if they started very simple. So there's one condition. And then as you got used to that condition and you responded to it, then they could add a second and a third. You could end up with a fairly complex condition, but you're allowing the person to learn the thing little by little, rather than here's these 80 conditions.
Right.
And so I think there are design features like that we could see, but I would love to see just their impact on bandwidth. I haven't seen anything like that. That'd be very interesting.
Let me shift to the last part of this conversation, which is about teaching in economics. The work that you do and the behavioral revolution, both in terms of theory and in terms of empirics and in terms of fieldwork and in terms of experimentation, has really changed the way economics is conducted today at the higher levels, in the graduate programs, in research, in top-level research, and is really changing the landscape in the last few decades. Yet, the teaching of economics at undergraduate levels is still blocked from this revolution. Somehow, it remains in the same way that it has happened, through unidirectional lecturing, very passive role of the students. And I wonder what you think about what needs to be done in terms of how we teach economics at the undergraduate level, not only in terms of the contents in terms of what we know now about behavior, what we know of how incentives work, but also in terms of the methods, how we teach in the classroom economics. If this behavioral revolution should also revolutionize the way we teach in the classroom economics at the undergraduate level.
Yeah, I think definitely, and I think it's sort of the behavioral revolution, the empirical revolution, you've highlighted all of these things. I think that if you look at a microeconomics textbook, it's quite shocking. It's like indifference curves, where does the demand curve meet the indifference curve? It's marginal cost curves, average cost curve, the minimum of the average cost is where marginal costs intersect. It's all these things that I know of almost nobody who uses this stuff at all anymore. It's sort of left over from the way we said the theory of the consumer, the theory of production, but it's just not what economics is today, and it's not what animates people. I mean, even take a book like Freakonomics, that's pulled in a lot of people into economics. Mm-hmm. And it's almost like we're not putting our best foot forward. If you simply said, what does it mean to think like an economist? I think there was a time when thinking like an economist meant indifference curves and demand, but I don't think that's what thinking like an economist means today. So if I was putting together a semester class that gave people a sense of what it was like to think like an economist, today it's much more causality, being able to collect data to test hypotheses. I mean, it's a much more fluid set of tools, including some traditional tools. So I think it would be great to totally revamp. I think the challenge is, if you look at the textbooks, they're still very much in that vein. I think if there was a textbook that just did this totally differently, I think people would be quite ready to adopt. Because most people even teaching these classes, they're not people. I mean, take a typical teacher of introductory micro. They're not somebody who sits there saying, in my day-to-day life, I use marginal cost curves. So it's an odd disjunct. It's like we're even teaching stuff that we ourselves don't use.
Yeah, but it's still about incentives. It's still about rules. It's still about the
exactly.
basics, but just in a
I
different
mean,
way.
even if you take incentives, there's a great example. I mean, why wouldn't we start with incentive theory?
Yeah.
Everyone can understand
Exactly.
incentive theory, but we don't have incentive theory anywhere. There's just so many things like that. You know, where is basic finance, the risk-return trade-off? Like, that's the hallmark of economics. Why is that left for some advanced class? I mean, it's just a weird reshaping. I mean, if you took the highlights of, forget behavioral, just economics, I don't think that production theory isn't, you know, so much trumps capital asset pricing or incentives or all the other things we've discovered. Yeah. Game theory. I mean, game theory is really interesting.
Yeah, and we can teach that at first year.
Yeah, there's nothing that we can't teach. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank
Again,
you.
thank you for coming to Colombia.
Oh, it's
to
my
Bogota.
pleasure. I loved it here.
Thank you.